Hey folks, Phil Gallagher here for a bonus video this week. Tyler K has donated for me to do a Snoko video primer. So today we're probably going to spend 45 minutes to an hour, who knows exactly, it's always hard to tell, talking about the various Snoko decks in Legacy, what is and isn't Snoko, and then kind of talk about like why you might want to play, not play this matchup, how do you approach it, that sort of stuff. I've got kind of an outline of everything that I want to talk about here, but I'm sure that I'm going to come up with other things as we're going through here. So just shameless plug, if you enjoy these sorts of things and want to see more in the future, my rate to record one of these is $20. Just throwing it out there. I've done a couple of these. I think the last one was on various Cloud Post decks. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What is Snoko? Oh boy, it's kind of a difficult question, especially if you're not playing a lot of Magic, because you go online and you try to research these deck lists, and you end up somewhere like on MTG Top 8 or MTG Goldfish, and you start looking for Snoko deck lists. And you realize, oh my god, nobody knows what Snoko is. So if you wanted to find Snoko deck lists on MTG Top 8, you would be looking under Bant Control, 4-Color Control, Bug Midrange, Blue-White Control, and Bug Control. You will find Snoko decks under all of those things because it is an absolute mess trying to classify what does and doesn't constitute this deck. The reason for that is that blue-green is one of the best color combinations in Legacy right now. Like, Tropical Island is the best dual land. I don't think anyone would debate that. And because of that, cards like Oko, Uro, and the cards that supplement them, such as Astrolabe, Veil of Summer, Icefang Coatl, those sorts of stuff, they're getting shoved into a whole bunch of deck lists. And so when we're talking about Snoko, we're not actually talking about any one specific deck. Snoko is sort of like a macro archetype where we're referring to a whole bunch of different decks that have the same general game plan, but can be kind of all over the place. Let's talk about a couple of things that aren't Snoko first, and then kind of look at this range. So number one here, this deck is often referred to as Uroza, and it is an Oko Uro Chalice deck. Despite the fact that like we have snow-covered lands here and we have Oko, this is not a Snoko deck. This is kind of its own thing. There's some overlapping cards, but this is radically different from what we're seeing in a lot of the Snoko decks. So, whereas Snoko decks might have Icefang Coatl and Arcum's Astrolabe, this deck is missing that stuff, and it doesn't have the cantrips that are holding together most of the Snoko decks, no Swords to Plowshares here, instead it has Chalice. So like this one is very clearly a different archetype, right? But it gets a little bit blurrier from there. So let me just double check, make sure this is all, yeah, okay. I don't have chat here, so this is all gonna be on screen. This next one is kind of in the murky middle ground, where I tend to not think of this as Snoko, but we're borderline. So I think of this as like an Oko Zenith deck, often referred to as like a Bug Zenith deck, although you don't necessarily have to be in black. There's some degree of variation here. I usually don't think of the Green Sun decks as being Snoko, but these technically have like all the right cards that are defining of Snoko, right? We have the snow-covered lands, we have Astrolabe, we have Icefang Coatl, we have Oko, we have Uro. Like, all the right sort of stuff is here, but this deck to me is built primarily as a Green Sun toolbox deck that happens to also just play all of the good blue-green cards, and boy, there's a lot of them. So this deck to me is a toolbox deck, not just sort of like this generic value-oriented deck that Snoko is. So these first two decks, I don't really think are Snoko. But what about Miracles? Is Miracles a Snoko deck? And this is where it's kind of fuzzy, right? If you took the Terminus out of this deck and just replaced it with 3 other removal spells of some nature, you'd go, yeah, that seems like a Snoko deck. That's totally fine. And this is kind of the problem with trying to like do clean data right now in terms of like tracking your results against various legacy decks. There are so many different decks that you can go through and see just, a third of their deck in game one scenarios, and you don't know which one of the blue-green X decks they are right now. Miracles kind of flirts the line with being Snoko or not being Snoko, and it's very hard to make this distinction mid-game. Like, basically all of these cards are fair game for being present in a Snoko deck. So, like, are you supposed to play around Terminus? Are you not supposed to play around Terminus? This is going to be one of the advantages of playing Snoko that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So, it's really hard to define what is and isn't Snoko, and like we can go on forever about like the semantics of that, but I don't think it's particularly useful. The Snoko decks are going to be these blue mush decks. They're going to be focused around Icefang Coatl, Oko, more than not now Uro, although not always, and then a handful of removal spells to back them up. But as we're going to see, those removal spells are going to be quite different from build to build. Just to flash a couple of lists real quick, just showing you this variety, and then I'm going to go back and like talk about each one of these decks a little bit more later. So here we see one that is a little bit more black based in the main deck with Drown in the Loch, Dead of Winter, Plague Engineer, and Leovold in the main deck. This is very common. Here we see Gold Ducat's Snoko deck list, which for my money is, I think, one of the better Snoko deck lists running around. But I'm not going to get into that yet. And this one, again, has Dead of Winter's main deck and a whopping 3 Sylvan Libraries to give you a leg up for the mirror, as well as a 3rd Dead of Winter in the sideboard. We will see Oko decks that have Monastery Mentor in the sideboard, a card that like you would usually associate more with Miracles than with Snoko. And you will see Snoko decks that are between 3 and 5 colors. And so while this one doesn't have red in the main deck, it just has like a single Volcanic Island, in the sideboard you have a whole bunch of blasts as well as From the Ashes. So when you're going and thinking about like, am I going to play Snoko, it's a little hard to just pick up a deck list and go, in my opinion, because there is a huge range of customization for what you can be doing with this deck. And that can make playing with and against it quite difficult. So, for example, how many Icefang Coatls are you going to play? Many of them will play the full 4. Some of them have trimmed down to 2. How many Uros are you going to play? This one has maxed out on the full playset as 4. But oftentimes you will just see it as a singleton. How are you supposed to approach building this deck list? That can be really legitimately tricky. All right, so why would you want to play some build of Snoko? I'm not talking huge generalities here because, again, there's so much variation. But generally speaking, Snoko is going to be strong against any fair deck. If you look at this deck list, you have a pile of Uros so you can very consistently gain some life, draw some cards, get some extra land drops. You have Oko to invalidate all sorts of things, from Emrakul to Chalice of the Void. You have assorted converted mana costs so you don't get locked out by Chalice. You have so many value-oriented plays, from Icefang Coatl to Snapcaster to Sylvan Library to Dead of Winter. Kind of no matter which version of this deck you build, you are going to be one of the best value piles that Legacy has seen in a long time. Maybe since like Deathrite Shaman was around, although I haven't put a lot of thought into that statement, so don't attack me in the YouTube comments for that one. So you're going to be great against fair decks, and you have these powerful and flexible cards. You are playing cards like Abrupt Decay, Ice Fang Coatl, Drown in the Loch, that are very good at what they do. They're strong, they answer a whole lot of things. And you're still a blue cantrip-based deck, so in addition to having these flexible cards that can deal with a lot of permanents or spells in various ways, you also have cantrips to find your cards. And even when you don't necessarily have the best cards at any one time, when you have Astrolabe as a redraw, Ponder Brainstorm as a redraw, Snapcaster as a redraw, Oko as a redraw, Jace as a redraw in some of the builds that go slightly bigger, you have a lot of different options. Another sort of advantage of this deck is that it's a control deck that usually maxes out at 3 mana. So in the past, we've often seen finishers of these decks be at 4 or more mana. So we've seen things like Jace or Entreat the Angels in the past, where you make it to the end game, you have a billion mana, and these cards take over the game and do awesome, awesome things. This deck just doesn't mess around. You just go, all right, you haven't threatened me. Turn 3 Oko when I'm on the play. Deal with it. And all of a sudden, you're under a lot of pressure. Similarly, if you're going and playing against something like Delver, you know, you drop the turn 3 Uro. They don't counter it. You've gained 3, drawn a card, put an extra land into play. Now their Dazes and Spell Pierces are worse, and they have to deal with the threat of Uro coming down a little bit later on and just like mucking up their plans yet again. And for some of the Delver decks, their best answer to Uro in game 1 is like bolting it twice. And so you make them hemorrhage cards, and all of a sudden it's back. And I think the last thing that is a real strength to the Snoko builds that I don't think people talk about enough is the matchup and card confusion that happens when you're on the other side of the battlefield from this deck. And this is maybe not something that you're thinking about because like you know the cards in your deck, but look at the range of things that you need to play around. Like let's just fish through these deck lists again, ignoring the Bug Zenith and Miracles one. So for this deck, you have to worry about main deck Drown in the Loch. You have to worry about a main deck random value Cling to Dust. You have to worry about sideboard Blast, sideboard Veils, Containment Priest. And this one has Hydroblast as well. You look at our next deck, and there's no red here. You don't have to worry about Blasts. There's no Containment Priest here. There's no Drown in the Lochs here. But your opponent might be playing around some of that stuff, right? And some of the Snoko decks have not even adapted Dead of Winter yet. I think you should be doing that. I think it's really stupid good. But some don't even have Dead of Winter. Are you supposed to be playing around Dead of Winter? Are you supposed to be playing around Terminus because you're not sure if your opponent is on a Miracles deck? Are you supposed to be playing around Veil? Like, this deck doesn't even have Veil. So, a lot of times you're going to get this virtual card advantage because your opponent is playing around things that don't actually exist in your deck, because there's so many different versions of this deck list running around. And then there's also decks that aren't technically Snoko that are still like very similar to Snoko that they might confuse you with in these first couple of turns of the game. So all in all, it's just really hard to play against this deck without perfect information. Like if you have open deck lists and you know what to play around, like great, cool, awesome. But like, I think this is the one that has Fatal Push. Yeah, like some of these have Fatal Push and like don't have Swords to Plowshares, whereas others have Swords to Plowshares, not Fatal Push. Like there's a ton of variation in what these decks do, and some of them have random one-ofs like Back to Basics, Spell Snare that you need to be mindful of, or they're just going to get you. So recapping Snoko strengths, great versus fair decks, you have flexible, powerful options, and your opponents are not necessarily going to be 100% sure what your build looks like, and they may confuse you with other decks and other builds, and you might get some free wins because of that sort of stuff. As far as general weaknesses go, Snoko is a little bit soft to combo in Game 1. In a lot of Game 1 scenarios, the Snoko decks only have 6 pieces of true interaction versus combo. It's 4 Force of Wills and 2 Force of Negations. Now, this is not always true. Nope, not that one. Not that one. Not that one. This one. Because sometimes you'll see something like a Spell Pierce or a Spell Snare thrown into the mix for a little bit of additional interaction. But oftentimes when you do that, it comes at the cost of something like the Force of Negation. So it really does end up being about 6 pieces of relevant interaction versus like quote unquote generic combo in game 1. And so a lot of the sideboard slots of Snoko end up being dedicated towards combo. So if we take a look at this deck list, for example, 9 of these cards are pretty explicitly for combo matchups. And in some ways, this is also for combo. The idea being that your opponent casts something and then you get to counter it and they don't get to counter back. So it's kind of like 9.5, depending on like whether or not you want to count this. Cards in the sideboard are dedicated towards combo. And similarly, if we look at this list, we have about the same number being dedicated towards combo. In order to fit in all of these value-oriented cards in game 1, which are great against the fair decks, and cards like Sylvan Library, which give you legs up in the mirror, the slots are coming at the expense of combo. And your cards like Spell Pierce, generally speaking, are worse because you're often tapping out for Astrolabe or Ponder on turn 1. Next, the early turns with this deck are often clunky and slow. And this plays in more generally to another weakness of the deck, and that's that many of the cards in this deck take time to set up. So if your turn 1 play is Arcum's Astrolabe, that essentially does very little to impact the board or the next turn or two, right? Like Arcum's Astrolabe is something that kind of is setting you up for the long run. So when your initial turns are like Ponder on the play when you don't know what your opponent is playing, or Arcum's Astrolabe, you're not doing much to progress your game plan. Icefang Coatl requires a bunch of snow permanents. Dead of Winter requires a bunch of snow permanents. Uro requires cards in your graveyard. Snapcaster requires cards in your graveyard. So a disadvantage of playing this deck is that you frequently have these slow starts where you don't quite have all of the pieces together yet, and you don't necessarily have everything online and good to go and smoothed out yet. And you can die in those initial turns before you get things set up. You know, if you're still at close to 20 life when it's turn 3 and you start dropping Oko, yeah, okay, you're probably going to be all right in that game. But if you've taken 10 damage by turn 3 because your opponent is playing something very, very aggressive like Eldrazi, and your Icefang Coatls don't have Death Touch yet, and your Dead of Winter isn't big enough to kill the Reality Smasher yet, you can get behind on curve and actually just die to stumbling, to not having enough time to set up your stuff. So recapping general weaknesses of this deck, you're soft to combo in game 1, and hence a lot of your sideboard is dedicated for that. Your early turns are sometimes clunky, and many of your cards take time to set up. Now let's go ahead and just take a look at a handful of individual lists and kind of talk about some of the things that these various lists are doing. All right, so we're going to ignore the miracle side of the equation here. Essentially, if you're playing Terminus, you're kind of Miracles and not Snoko, but like Miracles is basically still kind of Snoko, so like we're in this weird position. Essentially, if you're playing Miracles, you're playing Terminus because it's an instant speed, 1 mana answer to everything. Although this is another thing that requires some setup, right? So your cards like Terminus and Entreat the Angels require you to use your Brainstorms, Ponders, Jaces to set them up. And a lot of times these sorts of decks are also trying to set up like Astrolabe into Coatl, or alternatively Astrolabe into Dead of Winter. So like keep that sort of thing in mind. Terminus, I think many players are finding Terminus is clunky, and that Dead of Winter ends up being a little bit better and more free, just because you can cast the Dead of Winter quote unquote on curve or closer to curve a little bit more easily than you can Terminus. But Terminus is the catch-all and like is actually going to get everything. All right, so let's look at a true 5-color Snoko build first. This is a 4-color deck in the main deck, and the sideboards are specifically for blasts. So if you look at what this deck is kind of doing. Let's kind of look at how it fights combo. So this one has, I'm going to count Veil as a card that's good against combo because it is sometimes. This deck has like 12 different cards that are kind of good against combo, and these are cards that overlap elsewhere and are good elsewhere. So like Veil of Summer can do something like completely cripple an Amp player while also being fine in these blue mirrors because it's protecting your big important stuff. Similarly, Snapcaster Mage can be a card that's good against combo because it helps to flash these 6 cards back. But at the same time, in your fair matchups, it's just another copy of Drown in the Loch, Abrupt Decay, whatever it is that you need it to be. So why might you want to play a version that looks like this? It's all about just a 1-mana answer to Oko. Oko is really obnoxious, and in these Snoko mirrors that are going to go long, like definitely going to go long, everyone is playing value-oriented cards, Ice-Fang Coatl trades with, anything. Being able to win that Oko fight, is pretty important. And if you'll notice, like, this build has, like, not an entire playset of Abrupt Decays, so this makes it so that you have, like, 5 easy answers to an Oko that is already in play, 2 of which can't be countered. So a disadvantage of this deck is that, like, for some reason you're playing Damping Sphere, right? And, like, that's not a super good Magic card. I've never been super fond of Damping Sphere. I think it's awkward in many of these shells. And so, like, in this shell in particular, like, it's very awkward alongside your Snapcaster Mages. And I don't know how much I like that. So if I was going to play one of these 5 color lists, I might explore something else other than just Damping Sphere. But, like, that being said, this does do something against, like, the Ancient Tomb, Cloud Post sort of decks, so it's not like it's dead. I've just, like, basically never enjoyed Damping Sphere in any deck that I've played ever, so I tend to crap on that card pretty quickly. Alright, next let's take a look at Gul Dukat's list, which again I think is a very, very good list. I'm a huge fan of this one. So unlike many of the other Snoko builds of the moment, this one has maxed out on Uro. And at first you might go, that's weird, it's legendary. It's totally fine to play 2 of these in the same turn. So I played some games earlier today where my opponent had an Uro in play and then cast a second Uro to just gain some life and draw some cards, and then cast a third Uro to just gain some life and draw some cards. When you make it to the late game, and, like, you already have an Uro, like, that thing is whacking for 6 a turn. It probably kills your opponent in 3 turns, assuming they've activated, like, an Ancient Tomb or have fetched it all, and it's gaining you life and drawing you cards at the same time, and that's incredibly powerful. And 1 Uro will help to fuel the next Uro, and I'm totally okay with just jamming a whole bunch of these cards into blue-green decks right now. As far as the sideboard goes, I like the Deafening Silence that I see here. I think it makes a lot of sense in blue-based decks that can afford to be playing it. It's awkward in some cases, but most of the time, like, say you're playing against something like Show and Tell, where they cast the Show and Tell, that's their 1 non-creature spell for that turn, and then you respond with Force, Flusterstorm, Force of Negation, whatever, and I think that ends up being really powerful. This is a build that I see potentially being very strong in the mirror with 3 Sylvan Libraries and the full 4 copies of Uro. Especially if you're playing against one of these versions of the decks that doesn't run Swords to Plowshares. I think that was like this one. That are going to have a much harder time of answering the Oko in the long term. I think that's going to be very, very powerful. And so, like, if we look at the setup here for these post-sideboard games, if you're playing against something like Storm, you have a lot of really powerful cards. And if you're playing against a non-graveyard-based combo deck, you still have a decent chunk of cards that are going to be powerful. And I can't overstate enough that, like, Oko can just steal games against combo. Like, when you're on the play and you just jam a turn 3 Oko with one piece of counter magic backup, if you stop them once and then just start bashing them with Elks, like, especially if you've led on an Astrolabe or something like that, so you actually have another creature in play, you can just get your opponent dead and, like, hopefully find a second piece of interruption to stop them the next time they try to do something. And I think that's pretty powerful. And note for these fair decks, there's 2 more Planeswalkers in the sideboard, which is always a great place to be. Next, we have a slightly, I guess, fairer version of this deck, where the numbers on Uro are lower, but the numbers of Oko are higher in the main deck. So we still see a lot of things that we saw in the previous deck list, but there's some concessions to various things here. So there's a Jace in an attempt to go bigger than other Snoko decks. There's a Pierce to give you more interaction versus combo. And there's still 2 Sylvan Libraries here in the main deck. I have not been the biggest fan of Jace recently. I think 3 mana is the new 4 mana, and that a lot of these decks that are playing Jace in the 4 mana slot maybe could just be playing more copies of Oko or Uro instead. Like, obviously, Jace the Mind Sculptor is still a fine card in a vacuum. It's still, you know, one of the most powerful Planeswalkers ever printed. But the last year or so has seen a lot of pushed printings. And a lot of times, it's just better to be playing some of the new pushed cards rather than old classics. So the sideboard of this deck has kind of fairer cards. Like, we see Plague Engineers and Veils here. You know, we see additional copies of Abrupt Decay. And we do see a Monastery Mentor here. That's something that we're often not seeing in the Snoko decks, but there is something that I really like about it, and that is that it is a very good turn 3 tap out play versus combo decks. So most of the disruption that Snoko is playing for combo is free or is already played out on board. So Force of Will, Force of Negation are free. Deafening Silence is played out on board. And a lot of times you can just play this Monastery Mentor, and you don't need to play another real threat for the entire rest of the game, and Mentor will close things out quickly. So while Mentor might be, like, traditionally looked at as a fair card, this is going to be pretty powerful as an option versus the unfair decks as well. Then here's another, well, I guess here is another 4-color control deck, although this one is the one that does not play white. You lose out on Source of Plowshares, which I think is pretty huge right now. And the reason is that, like, Uro is a huge part of the format right now, and losing on the ability to permanently exile that thing is huge. So instead of permanently answering him from the sideboard, you instead get ways to answer him once. And that's fine and all, but it's a little bit scary to me. So this deck has some additional strength versus combo, because you gain Drown in the Lock as another main deck answer to various combo spells. Like, doesn't super matter what it is, as long as they've cantripped a couple of times or played some cards, you get to answer whatever their primary win condition is with Drown in the Lock. And you have six flash bodies that you can play in order to, like, hopefully help out with that. And this version has 2 more good tap out threats in the form of Leovold, which can maybe stop some of your opponent's cantripping early on. And, you know, then there's From the Ashes in the sideboard, which will most certainly mize wins in many, many matchups. So when you're selecting your Snoko list, you kind of need to think about your top 5-ish matchups of Legacy of the moment and think, what does my build need to look like to beat those? And what does it need to beat? Sorry, what does my build need to look like to beat the other decks that I care about? So I think right now, when you're picking a Snoko deck, you should be concerned with the mirror, and you should be concerned with how am I going to beat combo. I think those are the 2 biggest questions you need to ask, because when you get paired against Delver, like, how do I beat Delver? Well, I need to answer their creatures, and then I need to resolve an Oko and Uro and ride it to victory. And wouldn't you know it, your deck is already set up to answer their creatures and then ride these things to victory. So I wouldn't give too much thought to the fair decks when it comes to choosing your deck list. Like, your main deck is geared to beat most of the fair decks, and so there will be a few cards in your sideboard that you'll want to be adjusting, but probably not a ton. So think about like what combo decks are good and how am I going to beat them. So I am recording this video on April 11th, so this is a Saturday, and this is prior to Ikoria releasing. If you are watching this video in the future, Ikoria has probably shaken up the metagame quite a bit, so a lot of the information that I'm giving you today will be useful, but you might need to think about like how I am going to be dealing with the new combo decks that are arising instead. So for example, you might need to be thinking about Basalt Monolith based decks when you are going and building your deck lists starting, I don't know, what, a week or 2 weeks from now? I don't know when releases are. I haven't followed that. Okay. So in thinking about the mirror, I think the biggest cards that are going to matter are probably Sylvan Library, Oko, Uro, and Carpet of Flowers. So I've always been a big believer that in these mid-range / controlling mirrors, whoever gets an early mana advantage often pulls way ahead. So if you look at this deck, there's no mana acceleration. There's no mana acceleration. There's no mana acceleration. There's mana acceleration. So Carpet of Flowers is a card that I think is really, really strong in Legacy right now. I'm jamming it into all sorts of decks. And if you have the ability to play your Oko or your Uro before your opponent does, that's a huge advantage. So I'm on the Eternal Glory podcast, and Brian has been working a lot with this Erosa deck that has a bunch of artifact mana. And if you are playing your Oko on turn 1 or turn 2 instead of on turn 3 like your opponents are, you get a huge leg up in a lot of those fights. So I'm slightly surprised that I'm not seeing more copies of Carpet of Flowers in a lot of these decks. Because I know you don't get that many cards against the fair decks, but that seems like a great one to have access to. So that's something I would definitely be thinking about if you are a Snoko player. Can I afford to fit Carpet of Flowers into my sideboard? I wouldn't go full Madman and put it in the main deck or anything, because like if your opponent sees that in game 1, they would like try to fetch around it to the best of their ability, maybe leading on basic forest, or some cards like some deck lists might play something like a Bayou to try to like dampen the power of it. But like these Snoko mirrors are going to go really long, and even in the worst case scenarios where your Carpet only gives you like 1 mana on turns like 2 through 4, that 1 mana is still like the push to like Uro or Oko before your opponent does. And in the best case scenarios where like you've played that early and your opponent can't afford to necessarily play around it all that well, you get so much mana. It's absolutely disgusting. No, I'll go ahead and cut that off there. All right, so what if you are playing against Snoko instead? So you're, prepping to play in some Magic Online event because we don't get to play paper events right now. And like you want to be thinking, what do I want to be doing to go and beat this deck? And I think this is a very important question right now because like Snoko and various variants of it are everywhere. You will hear tons of people just complaining about, some combination of Veil, Oko, Uro, Astrolabe, whatever right now, because they happen to play against this deck 4 matches in a row. I think there's 3 primary ways that you should be thinking about attacking this deck list. Number 1 is to go under this deck. So when we look at this deck list, and I'm going to get rid of the sideboard here so I can move some cards around and do some things. When we look at this deck list and we kind of think like what cards are impactful in the early game, and let's say by the early game I mean turns 1 and 2. What cards actually interact with my opponent in most cases? It's like this and these, and I missed the Force of Negations. So other than like making a 2-1 or a 1-1, which I'm not really going to count as interaction here, there's not actually that many interactive spells in this deck in the early game. So if you are able to go under your opponent and start doing things that really, really matter prior to turn 3, you can get a massive advantage. So we've seen a lot of Eldrazi Stompy deck lists and top 8s of online events recently. And conceptually, I didn't think this was going to be a good matchup for them. Because like they have the Okas, they have the Uros, they have a whole bunch of interactive spells, and more I keep talking to these Eldrazi players, and they're like, nah, you just get them dead before they resolve anything that matters. Because the highest upside lines of Eldrazi tend to just beat most things. So when you lead on something like Eye into Mimic, into Thought-Knot, into Smasher, the degree of disruption that you're putting out there is absolutely absurd. Ugh. Sorry, not the degree of disruption. The degree of pressure that you are putting out there is absurd. And if your opponent has kept a hand that looks like maybe like 3 lands, Astrolabe, Ice Fang, Oko, or something like that, where they do still get to like play a card every turn, if you attack for like 2, and then you attack for 8, and then you attack for 13, like, and your opponent's like Ice Fang doesn't have Death Touch yet, and the Oko hasn't made you an Elk yet, or something like that. Most of the damage is done before their deck is set up and good to go. So if you can go hyper aggressively with something like Once Upon a Time Eldrazi, or with a combo deck that doesn't give your opponent a lot of time to sculpt their hand, set up, and play towards their more powerful cards, I think that's like the low-hanging fruit and the easiest way to fight against this deck. So, for example, earlier today, I played against like just 3 rounds of combo in a row. It's just like Black-Red Reanimator into Black-Red Reanimator into Blue-Red Sneak Attack. And like, if you're playing Reanimator, what cards do you care about your opponent having in game 1? Force of Will and Force of Negation? Source of Plowshares is often not going to be good enough. If you put a Griselbrand into play and you've drawn 7, you will just drown your opponent in cards one way or another. So for these game 1 scenarios, you're massively, massively favored. Now, can your opponent wiggle out of it? Yes, absolutely. You know, they can give Icefang Coatl Death Touch and trade with a Griselbrand. They can turn your reanimated creature into an Elk. They absolutely have outs to it. But for a lot of those nut draws where you have produced Griselbrand and Chancellor of the NX on turn 1, not so much going to beat those, right? So going under it, and TES is probably another great option as well, the Epic Storm. So those would be things I would be thinking about doing. Number 2 is that you can attempt to go way bigger than these decks. So right now we're seeing something we see a lot in Legacy, and when you get these mid-range to slightly controlling deck lists that are strong in the format, the other versions of the deck list are trying to go slightly bigger than the previous iteration to have a leg up in the mirror. So if you go bigger than the version that your opponent is playing, you're often going to be more favored, right? So what happens if you go way bigger? If you can go way bigger and actually resolve your spells, you can beat these decks. So Cloudpost is an option. If we look at the cards that are super impactful versus Cloudpost in this deck, it's the 6 free counterspells plus 2 copies of Back to Basics. And if we look at some of these other decks, the same is true here, right? It's still, or no, this one only has 5. So Force of Will, Force of Negation, plus 2 copies of Back to Basics. Or if we look at this one, Force of Will, Force of Negation, maybe Drown in the Loch, question mark. The damn thing here is the From the Ashes. The issue here is that sometimes when you're playing these like super big mana decks, if your opponent has 2 of the free counterspells, it's very frequently hard to beat them. So if you can play some deck that goes bigger than the Oko Uro piles and also has enough early plays that matter that have to bait out the Force of Wills, you can do well. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say your opening play is Ancient Tomb, Chalice of the Void, and your opponent has Force of Will. If their hand is full of this sort of stuff, they don't have to actually counter that, right? So a lot of these decks have between 2 and 4 Abrupt Decays that can just answer the Chalice at some point. They have between 1 and 4, in some cases, Okos that can turn the Chalice into an Elk. And they don't necessarily have to counter your spells. So if you want to be playing these decks that are running things like, you know, Emrakul, the Infinite Hunger, like that's a great way to attack these Oko Uro decks because like you exile Oko and Uro upon cast, and even if it doesn't resolve, like that's cool. But you need to be doing something else in the early game that threatens your opponent enough to actually force them to use their forces. And I haven't spent a lot of time exploring what exactly that is. But conceptually, I think it's very possible to go above these decks. But with all the donation deck lists that I've been playing recently, I haven't given Post a lot of thought. But I think conceptually it's probably fine. The other thing you can do is find an angle of attack that does not care about what your opponent is doing. So, relatively speaking, for a lot of decks, Icefang Coatl is not really a clock, right? Snapcaster Mage is not really a clock. So when it comes down to it, many of these decks have, I don't know, 6-ish real finishers. So like this one has 4 Uros, 2 Okos. This one has 6, but they're also different. This one has probably a few more things that we consider like real threats. So in a lot of these deck lists, you're looking at like maybe 6 to 9 real finishers. And that's not that many cards that you actually have to ignore. So if you can find a strategy that does not care too much about like Oko or Uro or Jace, then this deck kind of does a lot of nothing. So for example, I played Enchantress earlier today. And when my opponent played an Oko, they elked my Mox Diamond. Or sorry, my Chrome Mox that I was playing, and that was the best their Oko could do. And then it made a 3-3. Cool. That doesn't necessarily lend itself to just, like, winning the game, right? So while Oko might be crippling against a deck like, say, Red Prism, if you can play something that just, like, does not care about this Oko hitting play, then you can prey upon this deck. So Enchantress is maybe a good like fringe metagame choice to prey on these Oko decks. I expect my results would be very good with Enchantress against this deck on an average day. And another thing that isn't maybe seeing a ton of play is Merit Lodge decks. So some of these decks are playing Source of Plowshares and some of them aren't. I'm going to operate assuming that the Source of Plowshare ones are normal. But if you're playing a Merit Lodge deck, your opponent doesn't have Wastelands to actually interact with your lands. So as far as end of turn stuff goes, which is when you would be wanting to make your Merit Lodge, you care about like Source of Plowshares and to a much, much lesser extent, Icefang Coatl. So if you can set up a Merit Lodge with the ability to crop rotate for Sajiri Step, you beat this deck a huge percentage of the time. Now, there are ancillary things that you have to worry about. You have to worry about your opponent going to 23 via Uro or Oko. but a lot of times the first set of life gain actually just balances out the fetch lands that they're going to play over the course of the game. So it's not super a concern. So I think end of turn Merit Lodge is definitely spooky for this deck. And it's, especially if your opponent isn't aware that you're on a Merit Lodge deck yet, just because you had an ambiguous opener, then tapping out for some of these things like Sylvan Library, Oko Uro on turn 3 just kind of like opens the door for you to kill them. And that's something that I would have in mind. I don't remember exactly what the deck list looks like, but I know Bob Huang was messing around with, I think it was like a Bug Dark Depths deck. So I definitely think that sort of angle of attack definitely exists in Legacy as well. So I guess the other Merit Lodge deck to be thinking about is like actual factual lands, where you attempt to drown out your opponent over time via card advantage, in sort of a non-traditional sense. So I think Snoko has some problems versus a land sort of deck, because you can't actually take a Field of the Dead off the table, right? Like, that possibility just does not exist for a lot of these decks. And most of the Snoko decks are running Back to Basics as their thing of choice to deal with opposing lands. And that is huge because it doesn't answer Field of the Dead. So normally in the past, the lands decks have been killing you either by assembling Merit Lodge or by punishing firing you to death. Well, now you don't have to worry about Back to Basics beating you, because if you can put this Field of the Dead into game at like literally any point of the game, you potentially will just win with that card alone, especially if you can copy it and continue to have enough things to continue to make your zombies. So some of these builds have things like Surgical Extraction and From the Ashes to be fighting against lands, but for some of these leyline versions, especially when you won't necessarily be aggressively mulliganing towards leyline, you're not super good at dealing with the graveyard-based portion of the deck. You might shut it off eventually, but your opponent gets some early value, they get some life from the loans, maybe they ported you down for a while, and then you're staring down this Field of the Dead that is going to be very hard to beat. And you can wiggle through as the Snoko player. You know, some of their disruption maybe isn't ideal against you. So for example, if they are Maze of Ithing your Uro, they're not taking damage, but you're gaining 3 a turn, making another land drop, and drawing a card. So like, there's definitely going to be wiggle room to like do well, and I think that's one of the strengths of Snoko. Is even in the matchups where you're not favored, I think most of the time, because like you're a deck held together by cantrips and Force of Will, you have a reasonable shot at winning most, not all, but most matchups. And that's something that a lot of Legacy players really value, especially for paper Magic. When you show up to a paper event, you tend to see much more fair blue stuff than you do online, be that Delver or the 3 to 5 color control deck of the moment, like whatever's good. There was a second half to this point, but I kind of forgot where I was going with it. Nope, I've lost the thread that I was pulling on there. Sorry about that. No, okay. All right. Moving on then. Kind of wrapping things up. If you want to be playing Snoko right now, you have a lot of choices for your deck building, and you should be very cognizant of the metagame from week to week. There is a lot of online play right now. This is a big statement, but it's probably accurate. There's probably more online play going on right now than any other portion in Magic Online's history that wasn't like the day before a GP when everyone is just like frantically testing. On average, a lot of our events are very large. Legacy challenges, for example, have now been made, I believe, 64-person minimums. So there are a lot of people playing Magic right now, and if you want to be successful, I think you need to have your pulse to the format and really be looking at what's doing well and adjusting your list appropriately. I don't think this is the sort of metagame where you can play the same 75 for 2 or 3 weeks, get super comfortable with that 75, and then make changes. I think this is the sort of metagame where you look at what has done well in the week and you prep yourself for that week. And I think that the same is true of basically anything that you're playing right now. There is a lot of evolution in Legacy right now. I don't think the format is anywhere close to solved, and we're about to get a whole bunch of new cards dumped on us as well. And this leads me to the last point that I want to make about this deck. I don't know that this deck exists in the same form after the new set drops. We are going to get a lot of very broken cards in this next set. And unfortunately, that has been the trend of the last couple of sets. The companion mechanic is going to be very powerful, and it does 2 scary things specifically for the context of this deck. Number 1 is that it means your opponents effectively start with an 8th card in hand if they are playing a companion. And when you are looking to make these 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 trades all of the time, and your opponent starts with just 1 more card, that makes what you're doing a little bit less appealing. So when you make a 1-to-1 trade of Swords to Plowshares for their card, you're neutral there. But if your opponent has a companion, and you make the 1-to-1 trade, and they still have 1 more virtual card than you, you actually end up behind there. So while your cards like Uro, Icefang, Snapcaster, Oko towards the top of your curve are better, a lot of the 1-to-1 removal spells like Swords of Plowshares, Abrupt Decay, Fatal Push, and even to a lesser extent things like Blasts and Flusterstorms out of the sideboard, they become a little bit worse. And the other thing is that I expect people to be trying out a lot of new combo decks. I think Ant and TES both get significantly better with the addition of Lurrus as a 1-of in their sideboard. And I think a lot of other people are going to be trying out various janky combo decks, some of which might actually end up being good. There are 2 different cards that create infinite mana with Basalt Monolith, for example. And Legacy might be in a really interesting place for a little while. And while right now the Snoko decks beat up on a lot of decks of the format, the same might not necessarily be true once we start to get some refinement out of the newer cards of the next set. All right, I think that's everything that I have to say about Snoko. Kind of as icing on the cake here, most of what I've said today comes from the perspective of playing against Snoko and analyzing the deck list, listening to podcasts, watching people like Anurag stream with variants of this deck. And I have played a little bit of Snoko myself. I don't know, maybe 5-ish leagues or something like that. So keep in mind that many of the things that I'm saying are like theoretical and based on strong knowledge of Legacy, but it's not like I'm playing 3 leagues a day with Snoko. So take everything that you've heard today with at least a little bit of a grain of salt. And, you know, if you think I'm wrong, because you have a lot of experience, I very well may be wrong. Regardless, I hope you all have enjoyed and found this useful. I'm sure this won't be the last of these that I'll be doing. Cheers and have a great rest of the day.